Hello everybody and welcome into today's edition of One Nation Weather. We've got more storms on the way. That is available energy that's going to be moving on in. You can see some of that energy going all the way from the Carolinas back into the plains, especially all the way to the Gulf Coast. We've got winds, hail, maybe a tornado, but I think flooding is actually going to kind of overrun the tornado threat for some of us for the day today now. Here's a look at those filtered storm reports from the Storm Prediction Center. We had exactly 100 storm reports from your May 8th, so not quite as hectic as we had on your Sunday, but certainly Monday had some of those storms. We had some of those large hail reports into portions of Iowa, into portions of Wisconsin, and Minnesota, the edge of Minnesota as well. A couple of wind reports back into Utah, but the big focal point for some of this activity was as we go from out of the portions of the Midwest into portions of Kentucky for us here. We had one tornado report there into portions of north central Indiana. Now we do have multiple zones for severe and flooding today. Level 2 risk is going to be right out here along the North Carolina and Southern Virginia coast. We also have another level 2 risk that's going to be back into portions of Kansas and Oklahoma with a flooding threat overlapping with that, as well as one right along the Gulf Coast as we really have a cold front sagging southward out of the Ohio Valley for the day today. So you can see temperatures a little bit cooler behind that cold front, but still quite nice across the northern tier with 70s. But notice out ahead of this cold front, even into portions of the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, we have temperatures in the 90s, mid and upper 80s for many parts of the mid-south, as well as some 90s back into Texas, which is why, again, we have those level 1 to level 2 severe weather threats. We could see some severe right along the Gulf Coast, but again, one of those zones is going to be for the daytime heating to spark off some showers and storms that move off the coast this evening into portions of the East Coast and North Carolina and into portions of Virginia, and then, of course, that coming off the front range and going as well into portions of Kansas and Oklahoma. That's where we have the potential for some winds. All of these zones have that level 1 to level 2 risk of wind. We could see some very large hail, 2 to 3 inches in diameter, in that hatch zone for you there in portions of Kansas and the panhandle of Oklahoma. And again, the tornado risk is a level 1 risk today, but that's not a 0 risk, so I'm anticipating at least 1 or 2 tornadoes in this zone, probably on the brief and weak side, though. Here's a look at your afternoon energy. We've got plenty of that medium level energy making its way on up to the north, even into portions of Nebraska, seeing that energy go north. Also notice here along that North Carolina and Virginia coast, we at least have some limited energy in those zones, but with the daytime heating, we'll see some of those storms fire on off, including here in the plains. We might have a few severe storms as the morning goes on, but it's really once we get to around 3 p.m. Central when we get some of these segments to get going, some of these clusters of storms, some of them producing that large hail and those gusty winds. We could see individual little cells in this line as it makes its way into Kansas, which is where we could see some of these tornadoes pop off. Also notice some new storms developing back into portions of Nebraska and South Dakota. All of this will be pushing on off to the south and east as the night goes on. So around 9 p.m. Central Time after the sun goes down, you might be hearing those rumbles of thunder as you, for example, in places like Topeka, Kansas, might see the flashes off in the distance from Oklahoma City. And then notice how we continue to see at least some of these storms push their way on south and east as the night goes on, with some even new ones developing into Nebraska into the overnight hours. We'll talk about the flooding that could come out of those in just a minute. Tuesday at 4 p.m., notice we get a few of these isolated cells getting going into portions of central North Carolina. They really blossom as they make their way to the coast, though not to say some of these couldn't turn severe back from portions of the Greensboro area, back into portions of Columbia, South Carolina. But it's looking more like the places like Cape Hatteras, Wilmington, all the way along down here towards places like Sunset Beach, North Carolina. Those zones could get some of these storms to turn on the rogue severe side for us here. Now we have the level 2 flood risk from portions of Nebraska into Kansas, but look at this, a level 3 flood threat in that Houston metro area for us here. Some of that could go over as far as New Orleans. So let's first get a look at how much rain we're expecting today and into early Wednesday morning out of those storms in the plains. A good ½ an inch in many locations, but look at some of these zones in the reds. That's where we could pick up anywhere from 2 to 2.5 inches of rain. I think the max in this zone will be about 4 inches of rain, but that's certainly enough to spark off some flooding even into portions of southwest Missouri. And then here's a look at some of the rainfall getting going around the Gulf Coast here. You can see some of those heavier downpours, again, spotty from New Orleans and portions of Louisiana, but the really organized heavier downpours are going to be around places like the Houston metro area. Still seeing some of that rain along that coastline, the Gulf coastline, as we go around 5 o'clock this afternoon. Some of these storms could be severe, but notice while you see most of the spots getting ½ an inch, notice how we get these little red and yellow kinks in here. Notice we could get some 3-inch totals here into portions further south, but also into the Houston zone. We could see some of these 2 to 4 inch totals, which is why flooding is possible. Your Wednesday setup brings more of that flooding northward into portions of Arkansas and Oklahoma. We'll also have a severe and flood threat coming off the Rockies for us here, and there's where that severe weather risk is. Southeast Montana all the way down into the panhandle of Oklahoma. That's where we've got the level 2 threat. But this goes all the way along a dry line into portions of West Texas, even portions of eastern New Mexico getting in on some of these storms as new energy works on out of there. And yes, unfortunately, as we work our way into our Wednesday, more flood threats. In fact, surging even further north here. Little Rock might get in on this. Texarkana, places east of Oklahoma City for there. And then as well for here again into that northern zone. We could see some of that flooding. And more severe is expected Thursday with the hatch zone coming from portions of Kansas into Oklahoma again. And more flooding coming in on Thursday as well, with a general zone for some flooding from places of the upper Midwest all the way back to that Gulf Coast and the Mississippi Valley first there, as well as into portions of the Dakotas, as well as into Montana and Wyoming for there, a level 2 risk of flooding. Subscribe, hit the like button. Thanks to Tropical Tidbits and Pivotal Weather, as always, and the other credits.